Actually. Uh, Bhaskar, thank you very much for your time for coming to talk to us today. And as we've established, you're coming back to UCL again. So it's a great pleasure to have you back. So just to give some context to the colleagues who are present in today, I wanted to say that I wanted to explain how I came across Bhaskar's work. So I first saw Bhaskar's work when I started working on this information retrieval module that we started delivering at the Department of Information Studies. So Bhaskar's book, Introduction to Neural Information Retrieval, is on our reading list. And in fact, our students are reading the chapters from the book this week. So while looking into Bhaskar's work, it became clear that his contributions go beyond the technical side of information retrieval. And increasingly, he has been focusing on the societal and philosophical aspects of the information retrieval field. So while it was clear that information retrieval students will benefit from Bhaskar's talk, it was also apparent that many others in the Department of Information Studies would actually appreciate hearing about the work that Bhaskar has been doing more recently. So without further ado, Bhaskar, take us away and lead through your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you for the really, really nice warm introduction, but also a big thanks, Karen. And also, I don't know if Fotini is on the call for also inviting me and hosting me today. So as Karen mentioned, my background is in the information access. I did my PhD actually at UCL on deep learning for search. And then in recent years, I have been spending a lot more time kind of thinking about the implications of information access technologies, including the use of AI for information access on society. And so today I am going to talk about some of the recent work that I've been doing in this space. I will share the slides out later. And so if anyone's interested, there's also pointers to some other relevant work that I have been doing in this area. So let me just straight away jump into the core part of the talk. So just for everyone, I think this is like, everyone here obviously is very familiar, but just to kind of start from the same common point, like, just to start by defining what information retrieval is. So IR is the study of tools and methods for satisfying people's information need for and finding relevant information. And when I say information retrieval or information access during today's talk, I'm specifically thinking about tools and systems like search engines, recommender systems, and chatbots. I am explicitly excluding social media in this context because social media is slightly different in my mind. It's more about the interaction between people, whereas IR, I think, focuses a lot between the interaction between people and information. IR, obviously, as all of you must know, has roots in library and information science. And one of the core things about information retrieval is that these systems modulate what information receives exposure. And hence, through that process, it really deeply shapes consumer behavior, political discourse, culture, and even influence direct economic outcomes. So this is one of the contexts in which a lot of the societal questions comes up. So for today's talk, the real provocation for this talk is this particular question, which is, what is the role of computer-mediated information access in our collective struggle for social justice, universal humanization, and emancipation? This is obviously a really big question, and I'm not going to at all set any expectation that we will have an answer to this question by the end of this talk. I wish we could, far from it. But hopefully I will be able to pose certain questions to this audience that will have you later after this talk and to think about, reflect, and think about the directions that we could go from here collectively. So before we kind of go forward, I think it's also important to go maybe a little bit back. And so one of these classical IR papers that often gets cited when we talk about the ethical and societal responsibilities of IR is this paper by Belkin and Robertson, which was written in 1976, exactly half a century ago, where they talk about, first of all, they re-emphasize that information science has a responsibility to society. And what's particularly interesting, something that I was rereading this paper recently, and I noticed that something that they specifically talk about is the need for a theoretical framing, position, or understanding of what we even mean by public interest or social good. And in fact, they actually go on to say that we need to kind of develop our theoretical position before we get to a point where we find ourselves at the conflict between societal good and societal harm, and we have to make critical decisions. Otherwise, it might be too late. This is particularly a sharp comment because lo and behold, 50 years later, we are still at a point where this question of what IR for societal good actually means is heavily under theorized in the field. In fact, this year at the European Conference on Information Retrieval, I'm serving as the a track chair for the IR for Good with my amazing co-chair Maria Hos. And this year we actually decided to make the theme of the track to ask this question of what does IR for good actually mean? Because I think this is a topic that is quite critical for us to understand to make sure that the work we are doing actually has the desired impact, societal impact that we want to have, and also especially to make sure that in the name of IR for good, we are not actually working on things that might actually cause harm in reality to different marginalized communities and so on. So this in the ECR conference, we are trying to kind of start this discussion. And one of the things that steps we took this year to kind of try to make this question or discussion a bit more explicit is we encouraged all the papers this year to the track to actually write a section that explicates how they imagine the whatever intervention or proposal that the paper has is likely to expected to lead to specific societal change and to explicate any of their assumptions and so on, aka their theories of change. But it does leave us with this fundamental question about how should we think about what IR for good really is and how do we theorize this particular question. So one of the places that we could potentially look at for an answer is at the intersection of critical theory and information science. And so in a bit of the literature that does exist, I don't think I have discovered an extensive amount of literature, but this might also be because I am new to this space. But one of the some of the literature that I have looked at and specifically talks about that what distinguishes critical information theory from other lenses in this context is that we explicitly want to focus on studying information and information access with respect to the processes of oppression, exploitation, and domination. And we do this not with some misguided notion of neutrality between oppressor and oppressed, but directly and explicitly in solidarity with the dominated, with the oppressed, with the marginalized, and working towards the abolishment of all kinds of structural oppression and domination. And so this, when we look at it from this perspective, I think we can broadly classify the work that is happening in the community around that is societally motivated into these two different lenses, the liberal kind of approach and the critical approach. So the liberal approach focuses a lot on the desired system attributes. So for example, what are the attributes we desire from information access systems, such as the system should be fair or it should be trustworthy and accountable and transparent and ethical. Whereas in the critical lens, when we look at this, we focus on the what is the desired societal impact. So, for example, social justice, emancipation, democracy, and so on and so forth. And this distinction, I think, is quite important. There is a lot of very valuable critical work that is happening that started under the liberal frame. And I do want to kind of recognize that there is a lot of valuable work that is happening. But without explicating the social outcomes that we desire, we do not have a way to actually validate that the work we are doing in this area actually leads to the outcomes that we desire. And especially if we don't even agree on what the desired societal outcome is, then it becomes quite confusing or it's hard to make sense of what the work we are doing and towards what goal. And this is not just kind of a philosophical perspective. This plays out in a very specifically kind of day-to-day work in this kind of an area. So I like to use this example of when people search for the query CEO and do an image search, and they might see typically in most search results you might see a page that is pretty much all of it is male CEOs and pretty predominantly white male CEOs. Except in maybe in some of the search engines, this is a well-known example in this area. So some of the search engines I know have gone in and tried to make a a particular fix for this. But obviously, this is kind of reflective of a broader question. But now, if you look at this from a fairness perspective, we do need to ask, like, if you think of having a fairness intervention, what does it look like? Like, if you talk about gender, should it be equal proportion of men and women? How do we represent non-binary or trans in this context? What is their amount of representation they should have? Should this be reflect the actual representation of how different genders are reflected in actual roles for CEOs? Should it be reflecting the distribution of how often their photos appear on the internet, right? So what is the right distribution? What is the ground truth that we are trying to move towards? That's a pretty complicated question. The other thing that it also pulls out is like the question of whether that fairness intervention is even meaningful. Does it really change something in society if we did make the page like representative of women and people of color and so on? What if there was a completely different approach to doing this, which is to actually leave the page as is, but then create some space on that result page and give it to like feminist and anti-racist scholars, activists, and movement builders and artists to actually create an experience to teach people about the history of erasure of women, how women's labor has been devalued, how people of color's labor have been devalued, and that could have a society. So it leads us to very different kind of interventions. And another example of this is like when we talk about fairness, we sometimes apply the lens of fairness to the wrong kind of problem. So one of the things that I particularly find problematic is when people apply the notion of fairness to political ideologies, right? Again, if you look at it from the liberal frame, it might make sense that you might want to think about political ideologies as a left versus right bias. Whereas, in fact, if you think about it from a critical lens, it makes no sense to look at it that way because you do not want to, in the name of fairness, balance your SERP results to give feminist and misogynist results equal representation, or racist and anti-racist results to be equal representation, or like so on and so forth. So this is where I think there are fundamental differences and where we land up on. The second difference between these two lenses is the process or the kind of interventions we think about, and I already kind of like um, touched upon that with the example of the CEO query. So in the liberal frame, a lot of the focus is on the technological kind of harm mitigation, like ranking algorithmic fairness or kind of support for privacy, transparency, explainability, and so on. Whereas a lot of these are important also from the critical lens. But the critical lens, first of all, starts from rejecting technological determinism, which is this idea that like technology evolves in its own pace and in its own trajectory, and it is society that effectively has to always adjust. And we're seeing this a lot with the kind of the AI is inevitable kind of narratives that are going around. We see this a lot today. And so rejecting techno-determinism here refers to us saying that no, technology can actually lead to many different like socio-technical futures, and it is for us to explicitly choose the ones that we think will be beneficial for society. And then in terms of mitigation, it's not just about like socio-technical kind of algorithmic mitigations, definitely broadening it to socio-technical approaches, but also allowing for ideas like repair or refusal of the technology altogether. So for example, things like face recognition or maybe generative ads, maybe these are not technologies we should be making fair or better, but we should actually not be deploying these technologies in the first place because their primary impact on society might be like hugely negative. And all of the work in this critical lens happens through challenging power and oppression. So you don't want like transparency and explainability just to earn the trust of users. You want transparency and explainability to challenge the power of people who have control over these systems. Last but not the least, the liberal approach sometimes, not always, also tries to like be a little hesitant to be explicitly political and might represent itself or misrepresent itself as somewhat apolitical, but it definitely has politics which is focused on individual rights, equality, freedom of speech, and free market capitalism. On the other side, the critical approach is explicitly political, and it's politically decolonial, anti-racist, feminist, queer, pro-labor, anti-capitalist, anti-casteist, anti-ableist, and so on and so forth, and focuses on like collective organizing, movement building, and making the research as part of not just kind of academic work, but as part of our struggle and praxis for universal liberation. So we are starting to interestingly see a little bit of this shift playing out in the IR community. So one of these examples is this a workshop called Swirl that happens every 6 to 8 years within the IR community. It's called a strategic workshop on information retrieval and lawn in Australia. And so this workshop in 2018, they had so this is a workshop where they get a bunch of people from the IR community together to talk about what will be the most important things that might happen, like be important for the community for the next 5 or so 10 years. And so in 2018, there was a particular, one of the working groups talked about and added this to the report about, the importance of fairness, accountability, confidentiality, and transparency in IR. And the following year at SIG-IR, there was the Facts IR workshop, which again kind of pushed the same idea. And these two, and I think that those two does get a lot of the kind of credit for starting a lot of the work around fairness and transparency that has been happening in the field for the last 7, 8 years in the community, and a lot of really important work that has been happening. Now, fast forward to the next world that happened last year, and we exactly talked about some of these topics about the distinction between the kind of the liberal and critical frame, maybe not in those terms. And the working group this time working on the societal aspect came up with specifically emphasizing that IR should be centering societal, democratic, and emancipatory values, and not just be talking about the different kind of interventions like fairness and transparency. We are also seeing beyond Swirl this being reflected in some of the workshops that are happening across SIG-IR, Rexis, and other conferences in the community. So we have workshops that are talking explicitly trying to talk about the norms and values of the Rexis community, or the importance of looking at IR not just from an algorithmic lens, but from an interdisciplinary lens. This is the Beyond Algorithms workshop. And this year also we are organizing the workshop that is specifically asking the question about how we can make information access a force for justice, emancipation, and democracy. I'll talk a little bit about this workshop a little bit towards the end of this talk. And so we are seeing this kind of like a shift. And so if we kind of adopt that critical frame to look at this problem, one of the core things that, as we already talked about, the critical frame does, it does not shy away from the fact that information and access to information has always been very political. And in fact, it has been the site for conflict between oppression and liberation. And this is something that has played out with all kinds of traditional media, news, radio, newspapers, television, as well as in social media, and of course in kind of information systems, other kinds of information systems. So this might, first of all, kind of invoke kind of the imaginary from literature from George Orwell's 1984, and this is very much playing out. This is not just a kind of a hypothetical concern. This is very much playing out today in real life, where we're seeing this really harmful and harmfully named executive order in the U.S. Called Preventing Woke AI in the federal government. We are seeing all these incidents of what happened with Grok promoting white genocide conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi content right after, also connected with Musk himself, throwing the Nazi salute, and then also promoting mainstreaming white genocide conspiracy theories from South Africa. And also we see this playing out, for example, in the DeepSeek model from China, where it refuses to answer questions about Tiananmen Square and Taiwan. So this is becoming a particularly serious problem today, because what is happening right now in this moment is we are seeing this confluence of at least three different things, which is one is these platforms, and this has been true for quite a long while now, that they have massive amounts of user behavior data from surveillance capitalism. But the two new emerging trends that we are seeing here is the generative AI's capability to produce really, really persuasive and subtly persuasive language and visualization to change people's political beliefs and commercial preferences, and the ability to align these models either through prompt engineering or through RLHF and other kind of mechanism towards certain kinds of values, right? And this is what we, for example, seeing with Grok. And so this is together, if you put this together, it is kind of scary. And I'm personally, as a person working in IR, I'm pretty terrified that we are effectively now creating some very effective tools for mass opinion manipulation. So just imagine, like, for example, every time you ask for an information, either through your, conversational agents or search engine, the whatever, the kind of conversational or AI generated responses that are coming back is everything in that is trying to subtly change your political opinion or consumer preference. And even if you believe that some of these institutions, corporations, did not have that particular incentive in mind, which I think, to be honest, we should not take it for granted. It Even then, it immediately creates the existence of that infrastructure, creates the incentive for then authoritarian governments to try and capture these platforms or pass laws to force them to push certain kind of ideological imposition on these models, and by that in turn on the people consuming that information. So there is a little bit of recognition of this and in the literature that around the problems of AI persuasion, but also kind of hints that there might be it is pretty likely to imagine that in future we'll also see work on generative ads, and this is one of the area which I personally think is actually something that the community should come together and completely prevent from any kind of research work, just like we have previously done in different communities with, for example, things like facial recognition. So generative ads, I think, is going to be a pretty big problem for our society, and not just generative ads, but using of generative models in any kinds of information access creates a space for AI persuasion. And remember that when we are talking about these AI persuasion, we are also going to see things like the new kind of digital blackface, where you might have let's say right-wing white men generate visuals or videos that depict maybe people from marginalized group, let's say Black women showing support for authoritarian leaders or racist leaders that the community would never actually support, right? So we are getting into the system to a time when these our whole information ecosystem is kind of very vulnerable to all of these kind of attacks. And this topic should not be approached just particularly from looking at it from a technological lens. We really need to ground this discussion to think about what has been happening in the big tech in the industry broadly, because this is not just a kind of a thing that is coming and trying to capture the tech industry. The tech industry over the last decade or more has had a very strong shift towards authoritarianism, towards support for the police state, and all of these. And this has been widely reported in the in the news media, in research. And again, there is, for reasons that I will again talk about from media capture, these things have been continuously still not getting enough exposure and not has taken up got into enough of the mainstream discourse. But this is something that people have been talking about, including for example, the recent book by Karen Howe talking about how a lot of the work in AI has basically becomes projects of empire building. And it's not just the kind of the technological, like the pure algorithmic side. We are seeing this kind of intrusion also, or incursion in the discussions about the socio-technical implications of these technologies. So for example, we're seeing a lot of very bad faith and pseudo-scientific kind of things that are sneaking into and under the banner of AI safety, things like existential risk, and a lot of kind of these bad ideologies that Timnit Gebru and Emilate Petores very they did this really important work around kind of calling this out and naming it as this terrestrial bundle of ideologies, from transhumanism to effective altruism to long-termism and so on and so forth. And there is really, this is something that we should be really, really focusing on, especially because these are very deeply funded movements that are actively trying to legitimize themselves, and has a lot of followers at this point, both from academic circles as well as specifically trying to target students by creating resources for jobs and other things. And this is something that I think the community really, really has to be very careful. And it is unfortunately, I don't think we are winning this battle at this point, but something that we should be doing a lot of public education within our circles. And so we are at a point where now big tech finds itself in the same club as big tobacco, big pharma, and big oil. And I love, by the way, this particular quote from this article that says, society does not prepend the label big with capital B to an industry out of respect or admiration. It does it out of loathing and fear and preparation for battle. And so one of the things that we are seeing that is very central and shared between all of these big tech, big oil, big pharma, big tobacco is how the mechanisms by which they're exerting incredibly undue influence to shape public decision making. And I'm not going to be able to go into this in details, but like for example, Meredith Whitaker and others have talked about and written about how big tech and specifically the AI industry is capturing academia. There has been a bunch of different work, including a fact paper that we just got accepted. This is work coming out of the Abiba Berhane's AI accountability group in Ireland on regulatory capture by the AI industry. And there has also been work and articles around the media capture by AI industry and big tech. And all of this is really, really distorting our perspective of what is happening on the ground. And so here, just a quick personal note here as well. By the way, my background, basically spent my whole adult life and career in at Microsoft for almost 2 decades. First at Bing, and then at Microsoft Research. And then last summer, I made the decision to leave the whole big tech and Silicon Valley ecosystem in objection to their very active and explicit role now in class oppression, fascism, and the on specific and really importantly the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And these things are playing out really in front of our eyes. We are seeing these AI technologies not just commodifying jobs, but also unleashing other kinds of attack on the working class by, for example, these ideas or narratives that AI is going to replace your teachers and going to replace your doctors or nurses creates explicitly the political cover for the dismantling of our social services and public infrastructure. It's as if the to metaphorically speaking, like the response from the powers that be and in big tech is to the real needs of the society is let them eat chatbots. And we're seeing similar things like the connection with authoritarianism and fascism in how they are centralizing and creating the infrastructure for controlling our information ecosystem. And so this is now giving rise to obviously this is not just a black and white scenario. This is now obviously also playing into the very dynamic and ever shifting kind of the geopolitical landscape. So for example, in Canada and in Europe, this has pushed the need for digital sovereignty, and there's a lot of interesting and important work that's happening. So for example, I really like some of the work that's been done by the Open Search Foundation in Europe, specifically including their Open Web Search.eu project and Open Web Index projects. And I think this is a really good step in the right direction, but it is also a space where we should bring some critical perspective to remind ourselves that, at the end of the day, Eurocentrism is not a meaningful antidote to American exceptionalism, right? So the 85% of the world population lives in the global South. So when we are making these steps, when we are thinking of these strategies, we should think about the strategies that not just solves the problem for Canada or Europe, but actually helps us make progress towards getting epistemic justice and representational justice for everyone, for the global South and marginalized populations in these powerful nation states. And that's something we should foreground and think about what changes we further need to build on these kind of already ongoing work. So on this front, we have some recent work that's coming out where we looked at Amartya Sen's capability theory from welfare economics to really try and shift this discussion about how we think about openness, shifting it away from talking about openness in terms of what we make open to talking about what is the actual capability and that this kind of opening of the system actually give to the external actors in society. So this might be other startup founders or civil society or let's say policymakers or academic researchers. And this is where we want to we're trying to kind of come up with a framework that helps us to explicitly think about the kind of capabilities here could be, for example, critiquing the system or copying the system and making a derivative product out of it or changing the system itself. And how does these different kinds of capabilities connect with the kind of our desired states of being, for example, digital sovereignty or meeting underserved community needs, open science, or the societal aspects of justice, emancipation, and democracy, and how these different goals might require different kinds of capabilities. And we should explicitly talk about this to make sure that we actually building the things and solving the problems we really want to solve. And of course, in this context, I think I would encourage all of us to push the needle towards always centering the social justice and the societal needs of the whole of all of our society, not just the the global north or the top 1% or who have you, to talk about doing this for universally for all populations and especially all marginalized communities. So, having said all of this, like I think it still brings us back to the main question then. So, what is the alternative information access infrastructure that we must reimagine and implement in practice to really mitigate the risk of authoritarian capture and also to realize our emancipatory outcomes? And so, one thing that we can look at is like, in our adjacent communities in the social media landscape, decentralization has emerged as a dominant kind of an strategy to address this. But that they're also, and this is true even in the social media context, we have to recognize that decentralizing the technological infrastructure alone might be necessary, but definitely not a sufficient condition for realizing our goals. Because when you do decentralize the technological infrastructure, people still reproduce exactly the historical structures of oppression because our whole world is shaped by colonization and patriarchy and cis heteronormativity and so on and so forth. And so we end up seeing the reproduction of those exact structures back into the decentralized technological in over the technological infrastructure. And so we do really need to also, in addition to that, talk about how we decentralize and democratize our social infrastructure that is necessary for governance and moderation. And obviously, this is a very difficult question. And by the way, on this topic, I really enjoyed this particular podcast episode from Tech Policy Press where they interviewed Dr. Jonathan Flowers. So I really recommend if you're interested to learn more about this particular topic. And so, taking a step back, the way I have been thinking about this research in the last couple of years is so, first of all, I think we do need to kind of break out of our crisis of imagination where tech industry has told us there is this one path forward. AI is going to take over everything in future. Everything is going to be through LLMs. We need to really break out of that one-dimensional thinking and really challenge ourselves to imagine new socio-technical futures that are really liberatory, that are really for the benefit of society. And we should do that by allowing ourselves to be cross-pollinated with the thoughts and epistemologies from other adjacent fields, other emancipatory epistemologies like feminist, queer, decolonial, anti-racist, anti-casteist, anti-ableist, and abolitionist thoughts. And so, with that goal, I ended up doing this work last year where I proposed this notion of emancipatory information retrieval, which I define as the study and development of information access methods that challenge all forms of human oppression and situates its activities within broader collective emancipatory praxis. So here, emancipatory signifies the moral concern of universal humanization and universal freedom from oppression. And the different forms of human oppression, we are referring to the kind of structural oppressions like colonialism, racism, patriarchy, casteism, transphobia, ableism, and so on and so forth. And last but not the least, it's really important in this emancipatory IR context, which is, by the way, if you think about it, directly connects with the critical information retrieval that I referred to earlier, is that this work should not just be an academic exercise, but must be something we do from an ivory tower, but something that we do as part of our own praxis, our own struggle to fight for universal liberation and humanization. So in that paper, we also talk about I propose a framework of practices, projects, and provocations. I'm not going to go too much in details because of the time left today here. For example, the practices that I talk about is kind of diagnose and critique. So doing kind of systemic analysis of the implications and risks from these kind of new emerging technologies, imagining viable alternatives. So from really going to imagining different socio-technical futures and then elaborating how we get there, aka our theories of change. And the projects for emancipatory IR would kind of focus on safeguarding against surveillance or capture or promoting emancipatory pedagogy and so on. And last but not the least, I also kind of make it explicit that this work cannot happen in IR alone. We do need provocations from our adjacent disciplines and also from movement builders, policy makers, artists. This is a space where academia, science, research, activism, policy making, all of things have to come together. But there's still a question about how do we do that? How do we practically do that? And so this is one of the last work that I'm going to describe in today's talk. This is something very recent. We worked on this at the beginning of this year, where we looked at Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed for certain motivations or ideas for things that we can then translate to information access. So for people who might not be familiar, I imagine a lot of you might be familiar with Paulo Freire's work. It's a really classical work. And so the pedagogy of the oppressed specifically critiques this, what Paulo Freire calls the banking model of education, where the teacher is responsible for deciding what is useful knowledge or what is valid knowledge and depositing their teachings, and it is the student's role to patiently receive, memorize, and repeat those knowledge. So, by critiquing this, Freire instead advocates for a problem posing dialogue between the teacher and student, where the teacher poses the problem and the students are engaged in critical reflection and sense making of their own oppression. So I'm going to check the time quickly. Okay, so I'm going to try to quickly read through one of these quotes from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed to really capture the essence of what Freire is talking about. So he says, attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation in the act of liberation is to treat them as objects which must be saved from a burning building. It is to lead them into the populist pitfall and transform them into masses which can be manipulated. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for the liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientisation. And in this work, and so the paper that we wrote, we are drawing a parallel between Freire's comment about pedagogy, emancipatory pedagogy, and how we've been kind of the liberal approach of how we've been looking at kind of the socio-technical interventions. And in specifically, we are explicating the dichotomy that we see exists between technologist and user, and this frame of technologist as liberator. And so here, when I say technologist and user, what I mean is, so technologists are the ones, I'm roughly grouping people who envision and build information access technology, and users are the people who seek information via information access platforms. And obviously, there is a overlap between these, and I'm generalizing here. But the main argument here is that by holding technologists as the sole kind of responsibility solely responsible to make sure that information access is for the better of society, we are effectively making them the gatekeeper of knowledge and giving them tremendous influence over our collective sense making of the world. And we are turning the user and, in sense, the civil society and people as objects of technological influence to be monitored, to be modeled, and to be manipulated. And this is something like it becomes very obvious if you start thinking about how a lot of the algorithmic definition of, for example, algorithmic fairness has been. If you start seeing this exact parallel where it becomes all about like knowing what demographic users belong to and then how they should be modeled and how we should manipulate the results to have certain desired effects and so on. And so from kind of taking this page from Freire, this is what I would say to to people who want to work on the social aspect in technology. And this is the quote from Freire in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he says, our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 action in their favor without that trust. And so this is where I think we have to be have the same kind of carefulness in our work. And this is not a critique, by the way, that for the work that people are doing on fairness, transparency, explainability, but it is to say that all of those kind of work on those kind of interventions has to involve the community, and it has to the eventually the goal has to be not just like making the algorithm fair or transparent. It has to be grounded in broader movement building and with the goal of challenging big tech and to ultimately abolish big tech. And so with this idea, we in the paper propose this notion of Freirean design, which we define as a design methodology and a political commitment to engage users in active co-option and co-construction of technologies, which if you think about it, how do users get involved in information access technology? So the spectrum you can imagine as one is like there is no involvement. I just go and build my own IR system and I give it to users to use them. The second level might be, oh, I look at what people are clicking, and based on that, I decide notions of relevance, or I decide which features are useful for users, and that could be based on basically implicit user feedback. We could go further and consult the user, or maybe even further and actually involve them in the design. And this connects with a lot of the literature in HCI and other places around participatory design. But what we are talking about here is really to create a space where we are actually explicitly trying to make the platform amenable to co-option and co-construction by the community. And the reason we need to do this is not symbolic, right? Because we know that technologies cannot just gift epistemic and representational justice to the marginalized people. Uh, there is a lot of historical and cultural context that is specific to each of the different struggles for liberation. It is not the same thing. The structures of oppression and the historical context is not the same as the inner cities of US to the favelas of Rio to the bastis of Kolkata, right? And so you do need the community participation to do this thing right. We also know that technologists are never going to take some of the risks that are necessary to challenge oppression that the people in these communities will. So, for example, if somebody in the community wants to build a tracker for when authoritarian police is showing up to kidnap people, that is not something a centralized system will ever be building, but the community might. And at the end of the day, when you invite community to co-opt and co-construct, you are actually also creating a space for movement building and solidarity. And that's actually something also very important. So in this new world, the role of the technologies then becomes twofold. One is to kind of really surface some of the material risks that we are learning from the scholarship from that perspective, and to put it forth to the communities as an object of study so that the people in the community can study it and can see themselves as the necessary makers and unmakers of technology in support of their own emancipation. And on the other hand, also to redesign our technology stack such that it actually invites and makes it really easy for different communities to co-opt and co-construct the technology to build for as part of as to support their own struggles. And so what we do in this paper is we adopt this problem posing framework from Frege, and we want to kick off the process by posing some of the questions that we want to invite the community, both like the current, research community, but also the broader community in our world, to think about different approaches for solving some of these questions. And we hope that those answers further creates our based in design that further opens up the system to co-option and co-construction. So the questions here might be, just to give you an example, how do we design the platform from the margins? How do we design a critical democratic governance framework? If you are going to let people co-opt and co-construct, it's not about kind of a libertarian idea that anything goes. You do need to still have governance and moderation to make sure you're controlling against really bad kind of harm like CSAM, or for example, also making sure that you're bending the arc towards emancipation and justice. And also things like questions about how do we safeguard the platform back from authoritarian capture, or make sure that this platform can exist in the current economic and political climate, and so on and so forth. And so to end this, reflect back on this work, what we are not saying is that this framework is definitely not a miracle cure for the ailing growth of kind of global authoritarianism and oppression. But what we are saying and also is that it is not the technology that we are proposing confronts the oppression, but the encoding of the spaces for community participation, collective deliberation, and democratic negotiation within the platform that we believe that holds the key. But again, to go a bit further, it's not even sufficient to just create that space, because then it depends on the actual socio-political dynamics and arrangement within that space that finally determines the outcome. And this is where the work at the end of the day will be socio-political. It will be the work of movement building to ensure that in that spaces we are emancipatory, we are anti-oppression, and we are fighting for universal humanization and liberation. And so all of this work then fundamentally also involves us raising our socio-political consciousness, not just out in the world, but also within our academic communities. And so one of the things I talk to people, especially with students and academics, researchers new to this area, is to do a lot of reading, create book clubs, and create those spaces where we can start building shared understanding. And I also have started building up a bit of a reading list. If people are interested, it's on my slide here that I can point people to after the talk. As I mentioned earlier, we are also organizing a workshop in Australia this year in July at SIGIR that is specifically trying to ask the question of how we can make information access a force for social justice, emancipation, and democracy. So I strongly invite you, encourage you and invite you to come participate at the workshop. Our deadline for proposal for presentation is April 16th. So if you have any work in this direction, please do submit. I strongly encourage, and I hope I will see you at the conference later this year. So I will finish here here, and sorry, I know I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but I will finish here with just reading out one of the last paragraphs from our paper, where I wanted to kind of again capture the essence of where we are coming from. So that paragraph goes, our movement begins here. We are moved not by the opportunity to imagine a different socio-technical future, but by the abject necessity of it in the face of growing authoritarianism and oppression. We do not move alone, but in solidarity with others because our liberation and the struggle for it are bound together. We move not in fear, but with courage and out of love for our own humanity and that of others. Where the oppressor attempts to capture and control, we move to co-opt, co-construct, and liberate. We move not just to negate oppression, but to create something new, something joyful, something emancipatory. And I think that last point is something that really speaks to me, and I think it is really important because in spite of everything that is going on in the world today, I actually think that this is the most important point time for us in our lifetime to practice hope and to actually imagine that there can be a different future. And I will summarize that by the author Arundhati Ray's really eloquent quote, as she puts it, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm happy to discuss further and take questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Bhaskar. This was incredibly inspiring and absolutely amazing. I want to allow people on the call to perhaps ask questions first. Anyone? We have Bonnie.
Let me just pull up my question. So you can hear me all right? Yeah.
Yes.
Surely.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about what is desirable in terms of information retrieval and society. But I was wondering how do we take into account that what is desirable might change over time? Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think that is a very important question. And this is where I think, again, I'm definitely not an expert in kind of critical theory, but I think this is where we should be looking at people who've been doing these kind of scholarship from critical theory, from people who've been doing science and technology studies, even a lot of HCI. And also looking outwards to people who've been doing the work around movement building and the work for social justice, because I think in all of these areas that question has been very valid, right? And this is where we should not imagine that liberation or emancipation is a static goal, which you perfectly captured it there. It is going to be an ever evolving thing. And that is going to be true because the structures of oppression are going to be changing over time. But also as we hopefully, if we do address some of these structures or dismantle some of these, there will be new structures that will be emerging that till to date we haven't looked at, right? And this is true in our history. With whatever is happening today with racism and so on and so forth, let's also understand that some of the structures of racism that existed before were much more horrible and terrifying, from slavery to explicit settler colonialism, which, to be again, not saying slavery's gone away, not saying settler colonialism has gone away. They have changed faces and they still very much exist in the American prison system, or what's we seeing happening in Palestine or Kashmir and other places. And so I think this work also has to bring in the aspect of self-reflection. So where we should always be reflecting, turning that lens on ourselves, and be open to making that space where we have to deepen the understanding as we grow, as well as changing with the changing needs of liberation. And that has to be part of the work itself, of how we decide and theorize of the need for these changes. If that makes sense, Bonnie.
Yeah, this is a lovely answer, and I do have a follow-up, but maybe I should let someone else jump in.
There is a question from Nadia. Nadia, would you like to unmute yourself and perhaps ask your question, or do you want us to read it?
Okay, Nadia will read it on your behalf. Is this the case where emancipatory information retrieval should challenge all forms of oppression? How do we avoid creating a new kind of one-sidedness and centering justice, where certain perspectives are excluded because they're judged as morally wrong by dominant groups? How do we balance emancipatory side with the need for genuine pluralism and critical engagement across viewpoints?
It is a really, really good question. And I think this is where some of the tension between the critical and the liberatory frame actually is trying to kind of point towards, which is, first of all, kind of I want to start maybe from the topic of pluralism, right? So pluralism can reflect two different things. So one is the kind of looking at pluralism without contextualizing it in the with respect to kind of like the power structures and the power differentials that exist. And that's kind of pluralism for pluralism's sake. But the other approach is that pluralism should specifically look at who holds power and who doesn't hold power. And in that context, try to dismantle that difference so that the true pluralism is achieved by having not by basically having epistemic justice or not erasing the voices of the marginalized people. And so the question is always going to, this is what this is going to come down is to how do we theorize about power or domination, right? And these are not obviously not something that we can just apply a litmus test, but this is where I think these answers on the other side is also not like completely unanswerable. I think if we do look at the different literature, we do talk about kind of the structural mechanisms that exist and try to understand it. And our understanding of, for example, the structure of colonialism is much more in depth today than, let's say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? And so I do think we should see these as an evolving process. But at the same time, I think we should be leaning back on our scholarship to understand these structures and what, to aim for the real kind of pluralism that gives everybody equal, the ability to speak from all perspectives. And so that's where I think it directly should be challenging the dominant, when we talk about power, and this is where we have to be a bit careful, right? Because sometimes we see the kind of wrong ideas that, oh, just because people are talking about justice and that resonates with a lot of people in the society, they hold power. That is not real power. Power is people who are in high positions of government, people who hold enormous amount of wealth, who hold enormous amount of influence on the media, right? And that's where we have to distinguish this. But otherwise, I absolutely agree with you that we do have to center on the discussion about power differences and making sure that the goal of information retrieval is really to uplift marginalized voices in that context. If that answers your question, Nadia, but please feel free to let me know if you have follow-ups.
Nadia is happy. Aaron, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes, I'll give it a go. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about how do you feel, or can we sort of balance our desire for openness and making things openly available with sort of any attempt to sort of prevent that from being co-opted for sort of private inequitable gain? So I'm thinking particularly about, for example, the use or misuse of open literature and open data, where that's been swallowed up and used by, inequitable companies and software models.
Absolutely, Dan. So you're hitting on a very important point, and we go into a little bit. The paper that I talked about here, by the way, it's a 6-page paper with pretty liberal amount of spacing between sentences, so it's not a very long paper. Wait, hold on. Yeah, this one. But we do try to, in that paper, try to touch upon this topic. And that's exactly what kind of motivated us, which is a couple of things. One is that if you look at the history of these open movements, open source, this has happened. And this is really very strongly happening today in open AI model discourse, is that openness is now becoming basically big tech and the AI companies like, Anthropic and OpenAI are kind of co-opted that whole thing, where they're trying to get a lot of positive social goodwill by claiming to be open, but they're opening things in a way that doesn't actually give society any kind of additional power to resist. The other question is also about, and we also talked about kind of, obviously I mentioned the openness for digital sovereignty is different from openness for social. But yeah, so there are a few things in there. One is that when we make things open, we have to make sure it doesn't just, again, provide artifacts that big tech can just co-opt. And this is where I think we have to go back in history and look at the Free Software Foundation and the ideas of open on copyleft licensing, right? This was exactly the discourse happening a couple of decades ago. And also think about the notion of goodwill. But again, I don't have a direct answer to this, but I agree with you. Is like that is the discussion we should be having. And like for projects like Open Search Foundation and others, I think they should really center this and clarify what they are doing and how this maps to the desired goals. And I hopefully we can also nudge them to not just kind of connect with digital sovereignty, but also broader societal good. But also, I will be very honest, I'm very happy if digital sovereignty framing gets us enough investment to build some of the components that then we can co-opt to build something for also the global south. So I don't want to be challenged. I think we should see big umbrella. This is a big umbrella movement. Get together and let's build something that's for all of us.
So I will use my privilege as chair to extend for whoever can stay for one final question by Jaden. Would you be so kind to ask the question yourself? I think there's maybe some context you might want to include. All right, Jaden, okay. So Jaden's question: with open agentic frameworks like Multiple now being acquired by big tech, the point of capture is shifting from information platforms to AI agents and the platforms they act on. Does emancipatory IR extend to thinking about this agentic layer?
Yeah, so this is again a really, really good question. I'll be honest, I haven't specifically thought about the agentic aspect in this context, but I think part of this also aligns with even just general AI models, right? So one thing that by the way, I forgot to kind of mention that in this, not this one, but yeah, this paper that I mentioned, this paper, we are still currently revising. So you might see a little bit of difference in what some things that I talked about and what's in the preprint that we have already put out. But in the revised version, we are trying to make this also even more explicit that one of the temptation might be even before agentic kind of hit us to think about doing all of the guardrails around the AI models instead of in the IR platform itself. And I think that is actually much, much more difficult because it is very hard to kind of decide, first of all, to enforce any kind of prevent any kind of oppressive ideological imposition on these models because we really don't have any visibility of how these models are trained. The same way in the agentic kind of architecture, even the visibility or transparency is getting even worse. And not just the transparency, even if you do know how things are interacting, you don't have the control to power to change it, right? And so this is where I think one kind of maybe a cheeky answer would be that at least if you're focusing on the information access platform, you do get to make a choice whether you are going to deploy these models or deploy certain agentic architecture here. So the power of refusal is going to be important. But also for us to then reimagine, like if we do want to have AI models in this emancipatory IR framework or agentic architecture, how do we build it within our ecosystem in a way that we still have the democratic governance, we still have the push for emancipatory outcomes? And that's where, again, maybe connecting to Darren, your context, I do think we have to think about open doesn't mean open to all. I think openness we should think about as a contract. Like I am open if you are also open and we are both trying to go for emancipatory. It is not for me being open so that big tech can come and pillage all the work that I did. And so again, maybe that's where those boundary settings might be something where we can enforce good agentic architecture here versus potentially bad agentic architecture. Again, these are all questions. I'm really I don't want to give an impression I'm giving answers here. I'm really posing questions. And it's for all of us to come together and think of it together and work together. So.
Okay, on this note, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you so much for the very inspiring talk and the conversation this has prompted. So now.